Wonderful. So our first panel continues basically the conversation that we just had during Jonathan's keynote, and it's called Regulation and Governance in the Face of Uncertainty. We have three scholars working across law and political science on issues of uncertainty and regulation. Our three speakers are first Yane Svetiev. Yane is a professor of market regulation and private law at the University of Sydney Law School, and currently a visiting scholar at the Jacques Delors Center in Berlin. He previously had appointed at Bocconi and EY, and his work is on transnational regulation and governance, EU market regulation, and also competition law. And he'll tell us more about his work. Our second speaker will be Takuya Onoda. Takuya is a senior research fellow and lecturer in political science at the Hochschule for Politik at the Technical University of Munich. And Takuya's work is Takuya is a political science, and his work is in the field of comparative public policy and political economy, with particular interest in health and regulatory politics. Finally, we have a last-minute substitution. Thank you, Vincent. We were going to have Maria Weimer, who's sick and apologizes can't be here, but kindly Vincent Delhomme agreed to step in. Vincent Delhomme is assistant professor of EU law at the Europa Institute in Leiden Law School, after having obtained his PhD at Université Catholique de Louvain and having taught at UC Louvain and College of Europe. And Vincent's research is in the field of EU internal market law, EU health law, and EU food law. This makes us an all-male panel, which we typically try to avoid, but due to the substitution. So wonderful. Yane, why don't you start? And each speaker has 10 minutes, 12 minutes to present their initial observations, and then we open up.
Thanks, Giacomo, and thanks to ACELG at the University of Amsterdam for the invitation. It's always good to be back here, as to be back also among friends. So my, this panel, as it was described to me, is supposed to kind of talk about techniques of regulation and governance, or mechanisms of regulation and governance under conditions of uncertainty. And my own remarks will draw on a project that I'm currently still working on at the University of Sydney, financed by the Australian Research Council, on the use of peer reviews, transnational peer reviews in financial regulation. So what what we're studying in the project is essentially three transnational settings in which there has been a kind of an effort to strengthen the international architecture or the transnational architecture for financial regulation in three different settings, all of which involve basically the creation or the strengthening of a peer review mechanism. And so one of the questions that this particular paper tries to ask is, well, what could potentially be the role that this peer review mechanism plays in the three settings? As Jonathan's framing remarks suggested, peer review of comparative experience is one of the if you want, the elements of experimentalist governance. But of course, peer review could also perform other functions. This is transnational peer review, whereby officials from different member jurisdictions essentially review both the regulatory framework, the national regulatory framework, and even individual decisions by national regulators within the ambit of the regulatory field in which they operate. And so the three case studies that we study in our project, one of them is the European Securities and Markets Authority, which of course has a robust peer review mechanism, actually the pioneering peer review mechanism in European financial regulation. The other is the Financial Action Task Force, which is a transnational regulatory network focused on money laundering and terrorism financing. And the third one is the Financial Stability Board, which was created in the aftermath of the financial crisis to coordinate the international response to financial instability triggered in one country, then having spillover effects, cross-border spillover effects. So those are the three papers that we have published on the individual case studies. And then in my book on experimentalist competition law and the regulation of markets from some years ago, which was actually launched, I think, in this room, there is a discussion of a wider set of formalized peer review mechanisms that operate in the European Union, where peer review has essentially, in many fields, become a kind of formal precondition for taking regulatory action, even at the national level. And so in this paper, what we see is that what we're looking at is that in the context of the very significant effects of the financial crisis starting in 2008 in the United States and then continuing as a kind of banking and sovereign debt crisis in the European Union subsequently, what we try to do is to kind of have a look at what influential, policymakers and opinion makers were formulating as the objective of the renewal of the transnational financial architecture in the aftermath of the crisis. And what you will see there is a set of quotes that basically talk about the need to rebuild trust within the financial market, which is both trust between the financial sector and their customers or even society at large, but also to the need to rebuild a transnational trust, whereby the both customers and regulators in one jurisdiction can have confidence and trust in the regulatory frameworks of other jurisdictions to the extent that we're going to allow integrated financial markets, but not suffer from the negative spillover effects of weak financial regulation in one jurisdiction. And so there is this kind of discourse of the need to rebuild trust and confidence both within but also across jurisdictions. And the question you might say is, well, okay, so how do you sort of do that, given that we're talking about very complex institutions and systems, both as the players but also as the regulators? Here there is a kind of, on the one hand, there is the conclusion of many who work on financial regulation that there is not necessarily a magic bullet that allow you to kind of develop a set of rules and practices that avoid financial instability. And on the other hand, there is the literature which suggested that the best way to achieve that outcome, to avoid negative spillovers from integrated financial markets, while at the same time protecting domestic consumers of financial intermediaries, was to develop a kind of set of binding rules which are internationally binding and enforced through international binding instruments. Okay? So there is an influential literature in the aftermath of the crisis that that's the solution to this problem. Now, what we observe in our research is that across all of these settings that we study, that's not something that's happened, okay? So rather than the creation of binding legal instruments and binding formal third-party enforcement mechanisms, across all of these settings, what we observe is the formalization or the strengthening of existing peer review mechanisms. And so here you have on this slide two examples of what was done in the Financial Stability Board, which focuses on prudential regulation, which says the only obligation of the membership to the Financial Stability Board is to undertake peer reviews, which focus on the implementation and effectiveness of international financial standards. Developed by standard-setting bodies. These are non-binding standards that are developed either by private standard setters or by regulatory networks, and of policies agreed within the Financial Stability Board. Similar sort of thing with the Financial Action Task Force, where over time what was developed was a peer review mechanism which focuses on the implementation of the FATF recommendations, which in themselves are a form of non-binding standards. And then even in the European Union, where of course all of us as EU lawyers would know that there is actually a kind of binding legal framework at the EU level, which essentially frames the supervision by the national supervisory authorities. Even there, where legal rules were available, what we see is that one of the key mandates that was given to ESMA under Article 8 of the ESMA founding regulation was to organize and conduct peer review analyses of authorities, including for the issuing of guidelines and recommendations and identification of best practices to link to Jonathan's discussion earlier. Now you will see there that the topics of peer review under Article 30 focus on a set of things which are not necessarily simply the implementation of rules and standards, although historically the CSER peer review mechanism that preceded ESMA did focus on the implementation of rules and standards. Now, what's interesting for us is, to the extent that in all of these settings, you basically have the elaboration or the strengthening of peer review mechanisms in the face of this kind of need to rebuild cross-jurisdictional trust in the national regulatory frameworks. How could peer review mechanisms perform that role? And there are kind of, three hypotheses that we make. One is that even though most of the transnational standards, for example, both under the FSB and the FATF are not technically binding, what peer review could do is be a kind of substitute enforcement mechanisms to ensure that the standards have essentially been implemented appropriately at national level. So it's a kind of substitute enforcement mechanism through generating some kind of informal peer or market pressure to implement those standards. Secondly, it could be a mechanism which is not so much focused necessarily on the implementation of rules, but it's a mechanism that allows experts from other member states to both observe what's happening at the national level and to characterize it as compliant or non-compliant with the common standards, and even to socialize actors into basically believing in the norms that have been elaborated at the international level, and therefore kind of making their application in daily domestic decision-making a form of kind of, consistent with their own intrinsic, let's say, understanding and motivation. And finally, particularly if you look at the focus on the kinds of actors that take decision at the national level, it could be a kind of attempt to ensure some degree of homology or similarity between the kinds of actors that take consequential decisions, right? So the insistence that you have a certain type of expertise in national regulators that take certain decisions, that they be independent from both political and industry influence, that they have certain guaranteed budgets and training, is a way of kind of saying, well, look, even if we can't ensure through rules or through observing every single action at the national level, whether the common norms are being implemented, maybe we could ensure that the kinds of actors that are taking the consequential decisions are in fact similar. They have similar training, similar understanding, similar professionalization and independence in order to ensure that they kind of take similar sorts of actions across the board. And then you can even take that a step further, where you can say, well, the regulatory practices and templates that these actors use should be the same. We can verify whether they in fact use the same kinds of models when they regulate within their own spheres of regulation. Now, What I'll tell you by way of my concluding slide is that even though these three settings are quite different and that they don't appear to be in dialogue with each other, across the three settings we sort of observe a set of common transformations. Okay? Now, the first is that all of them start by verifying whether rules and standards elaborated at the transnational level have been implemented at the domestic level, whether or not those rules or standards were binding. Okay. But all of them shift away from that focus. Okay. And so, this idea that sort of having a set of laws on the books somehow guarantees that that regulation is being performed adequately is quickly understood to be insufficient. Okay, and the first transformation in all of these settings is towards this idea of kind of trying to check for technocratic trust proxies. Do you have a competent authority? How is that authority set up and governed? How is it funded? Is it independent? Does it have the necessary sort of expertise? But none of these appear to be kind of tick box mechanisms there you can say, oh yes, the authority is sufficiently independent, it has the right number of staff. When these kinds of things are verified, the context becomes very, very relevant. How much staff do you need to have? Depending on how large, for example, your financial market is, how do they need to be trained? What is their relationship with political bodies? Should they be accountable to political bodies or not? That depends on the institutional arrangements of member states. So, these kind of look like they're easy proxies that you can sort of verify and say, oh, well, you have the right kind of body in place, but that doesn't really work because context becomes very, very relevant. And so you need to get, again, back into the nitty-gritty of, national circumstances. And then, you could kind of try and look at these regulatory templates and whether they follow certain types of recommended practices and models of regulation. So again, common across the three is a move from rule-based towards a risk-based regulation, which is an attempt to contextualize essentially regulatory efforts. Because if you say that your regulatory intensity needs to be commensurate to the risks that are presented by your domestic institutions, that means that, rather than having kind of, one size fits all rules that everybody has to implement, you're sort of saying, well, your domestic efforts have to be commensurate to the risks that you face. But in many of these settings, then what that exactly means in specific regulatory efforts is not very well elaborated. There are no methodologies often to kind of, properly assess risk, certainly in the money laundering context. And in financial stability, where you are providing these, stress testing models for assessing risk, they often kind of focus on the risks of the past and depend on you having sufficient oversight of the kinds of institutions at issue. And similarly, a similar kind of problem with both the need to be agile, but also to be context specific is faced by ESMA when it tries to impose common practices of supervision at the national level. And then the final transformation, which is where I'll end and we can discuss what that sort of, might mean in this context, is that all three peer review frameworks move from kind of relying on self-reported information by national authorities as the precursor to peer review to on-site visits and direct stakeholder engagement. So that means that part of the peer review process is not just to review paper reports of what it is that's being done at the national level, but actually to sort of go on site, look at what the authorities are doing, and then also consult with the local stakeholders in order to better understand the way in which the the national authorities exercising its functions. And so, one way to understand those is to say that this is kind of like, this sort of trust but verify mechanism where, you kind of go in and do mystery shopping to see whether the national authority is kind of doing the right thing. But as we try to argue, that's not how these on-site visits work. The other way to understand it is that it's a kind of processual trust building through ongoing engagement. But I can elaborate on that if people. So stop.
Wonderful. Thanks, Yane. Takuya.
Working. Yeah. Right. Okay. Is it okay?
Yes.
Right. Well, thank you so much for including me to this fabulous conference and wonderful panel. So my talk is about politicization. By politicization, I mean the expansion of conflict within political systems, including in the public arena, in the sense of public contestation, mobilization, expansion of actors that bring into the public arena, and also government arena in the sense that the challenges of regulatory authority and institutional authority of these regulatory bodies. So in a kind of in this talk, I'm treating politicization in an encompassing sense. And defining this way, politicization is, well, everywhere, it seems. Central banks' decisions are publicly contested, regulatory authorities' legitimacy are challenged in Europe and across different parts of the world. And my remark makes three sort of set of proposition for the way of provocation and this to invite discussion. So one is about origins of politicization. I also talk about how non-majoritarian institutions navigate politicization. And then third, I'm going to talk about consequences of politicization. So in doing so, I draw loosely on my forthcoming book. That is, I'm right now sort of really finishing. That is coming out of Oxford University Press in hopefully 2027. And where I propose a new theoretical approach for understanding politicization of non-majoritarian institutions, drawing on a case of pharmaceutical regulation. And this is a pricing and reimbursement. So it is on the competence of national level authorities. I draw on England, France, and other European countries and beyond. But my theoretical argument, I believe, is relevant to EU level regulation as well. So I'd love to share sort of your thoughts and views around and your sector's expertise at the EU level. So this talk is purely in that sense theoretical sort of messages or lessons that I try to distill from my book project. So before I begin to my sort of three sort of propositions, just let's go back to 1990s, and we already had this sort of question before. But if anything, uncertainty was actually central in the debate around the rise of regulatory state in the 1990s, when the term regulatory state was spread in the academia and policy discourse across Europe. And especially the same conditions of globalization, interdependence, technological change, and expansion of the EU, and also in this context, the rise of expanded role of the European Parliament, and to that day, what people saw as a politicization of European Commission as a less technocratic body, which is still quite more technocratic than the current European Commission. And back then, the solution that Gian Domenico Maione and other influential political scientists consider was a derogation to powers to non-majoritarian institutions. So credibility in this sense was considered as a uncertainty was in this sense considered as a problem of credibility. Politicians promise to commit to long-term policy goals that is beneficial for society as a whole is not credible because your government is going to be replaced by another politicians and on the next day. By delegating powers to an political insulated independent regulator, either supranational or national level, then ensure that it is used as a policy stability and legitimacy that enabling long-term policy problem solving that is beneficial for the whole society. And if you read in Maione's essay in 2000, Maione proposes a greater role of EU agencies and transnational networks of information sharing and coordination and mutual learning. So it's a kind of rationalist, the proposal for greater regulatory network centered around EU agencies. What was the problem? So this assumption around achieving allocative efficiency by committing towards a long-term policy goals downplay distributive consequences. Regulatory policies, even if that is improving, create winners and losers. Loss imposition triggers counter mobilization against the policy. Emerging coalitions that arrive after the creation of institutions cannot be by design tempered at the time of creation. So uncertainty in this sense was not just what Terry Moore political scientists called political uncertainty in the sense of government replacement risk, which is more like a risk rather than uncertainty, or strategic uncertainty in a Maione sense, in the sense of whether you can create coordination between different actors. But it is also about uncertainty of what social and political conflicts and coalitions that the policies are making in the downstream that are unfolding over time, which require us to look more at the advanced alternative path-centered approach and also attentive to temporal sequences over time, which I'm going to propose from now on. So the first message here is that it's about the origins. And I'm going to talk about endogenous origins of politicization. So when non-majoritarian institutions are highly insulated, and their very functioning can create politicization through their policymaking. Why is that? If authorities transferred at the EU level or international regulatory agencies, because they are highly insulated, they can make a decision that is beyond what is politically possible. They can create a decision that is more politically costly. However, making politically costly decision possible also means that can in turn generate counter mobilization involving actors outside this regulatory and governmental arena, undermining the very policy over time. So this idea is not just about what EU integration theory often says about transfer of authority or transfer of expansion of competences per se, but it is about driven through the policymaking of non-majoritarian institutions. And if you think about European Central Bank's role during structural reform and its differentiated politicization across Southern European countries, this illustrates my point here. So that's the origin. Okay, so then how non-majoritarian institutions such as independent regulatory agencies can navigate politicization, and especially if they are highly insulated, meaning that, as I said, the solution to this credibility problem and developing their expertise and effectiveness. This means that politicization, I say, and in turn demands for responsiveness to public pressure are in tension with their established credibility. Why is that? So to build credibility, these politically insulated independent regulatory agencies need to develop need to use several tools, such as making rules, mobilizing expertise to defend their positions in the policy debate. However, that also means over time, as these regulatory rules entrenched and regulatory paradigm getting thicker, it constrains flexibility and responsiveness to public pressure over time, which resulting in what I call a legitimacy trap. So oftentimes independent regulatory agencies and central banks are trapped in a local hard place where you can't unable to respond without damaging established credibility. But if you respond, if you are unresponsive, your organization is going to be at risk. So that's a sort of, and this also sort of, illustrates and explains several regulatory behavior, why regulators don't respond to, public controversies so easily. Oftentimes they sort of usually are silent or ignore what's going on in a public sphere. It is not because they are confident about their reputation. It is because they are trapped by the past, success. They are victim of their own success. Finally, consequences. So third point I want to make is the consequences. However, what I said was this entrenchment of those norms, regulatory paradigms, and all the rules make them resilient against politicization. So the picture is that there is an institutional entrenchment combined with greater conflict stability rather than stability that those advocates in the 1990s regulatory state hope and dream of as a technocratic sort of dream. So when they are caught by this past credibility building, no majoritarian institution can adapt only cautiously because of their past sort of building of credibility without they are sort of facing a risk of damaging their reputation and the credibility that makes them legitimate in the first place. That also means that we are going to expect there's a coexistence of conflicting rules and logical instruments that are placed on top of these regulatory paradigms, and also politicians create new rules on top of existing regulatory regime, what political scientists often call layering. And then the final point is this uncertainty around distributed consequences and power relations and conflicts and social coalitions cannot be fundamentally resolved, meaning that we are going to expect political contestation and policy instability will remain, even though there is an entrenchment of the regulatory state. Thank you so much. These ideas are coming from some of my papers, so if you're interested, just let me know. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Takuya. And finally, we have Vincent. You have slides, Vincent? Yes.
Thank you so much for having me last minute. So I will try to replace my environment the best I can. For the last minute presentation, I've wrapped up some past and current reflections that I have in my field of inquiry, which is indeed the field of lifestyle-related health risks. What do I mean by that? Basically, three main things, which are tobacco, alcohol, and unhealthy foods, which are usually conceptualized in the same way because they expose consumers to comparable hazard and risk, which are non-communicable diseases. I think we're all aware of that, so I won't expand. I won't talk about alcohol today also because there's not much EU law on the topic. So we see a growing role for EU law in policy. There's also a book coming up if you're interested next year, hopefully. And what I find interesting with that field is that it's ripe with political contestation, so maybe I'll build on that. In terms of morals and ethics, is it good or bad to smoke, do drugs, drink, etc. Cultural diversity among member states, we think of food, it's kind of obvious example, and scientific uncertainty. So that's what I will focus on, but I will come back to the ethics and the culture as well. One of the many questions that I've been interested in when it comes to this field of the law and policy is how to manage uncertainty specifically in that area. I think you can see some lessons that you can extend to other specific other fields, but there are also specific questions because precisely of this ripeness with political contestation. Briefly, what we see is that, so if we think generally of uncertainty and risk, think of two types of uncertainty. One, at the level of assessment of the risk. Is there a risk? How big is it? The magnitude of the risk concerning the exposure, etc. Those familiar concept of risk regulation. Is it dangerous or not? In this field specifically, it's not a big question because we know it's dangerous. We know pretty much how much. We know what are the consequences. There are some pockets of uncertainty. For instance, e-cigarettes. I'll come back to that. But overall, we know what's going on. Where there's a much higher degree of uncertainty, it's over policies. What do we do to fix the problem? To make people, that's what you want, smoke less or smoke not, drink less, eat better. How does that work? Especially considering that we need a regulatory mix, so we don't have separated measures, but we have labeling, taxes, and they all work together. So how do we do that? So I'll go with you through three sort of case studies and hopefully show the most salient issues when it comes to the governance of uncertainty in those three case studies. The first two are linked to something that I've noticed, without really actually looking for it while I was researching the field during my PhD, which is the use of EU law, I believe in a manner different than the experimental governance that was exposed at the beginning, but I'm happy to hear your views as well. EU law as an evidence catalyst, the use of EU law to create evidence when we lack evidence, which I thought was rather interesting. And there are two examples for that: is the plain packaging for tobacco and front of pack nutrition labeling. And I'll delve right into it. So for the two case studies, we see quite the beginning is a bit similar. So and that goes also, that links with the usual political cycle of how EU law is made. So when the impact assessments were done for those two pieces of legislation, I'm starting with the Tobacco Products Directive. It was envisaged to have plain packaging for tobacco products. I think we're all aware of what it is, but if not, that's what you see on the picture. No very small brand name, devoid of colors and any visual elements. The idea is to reduce the attractiveness of plain tobacco products. So it was envisaged in 2014 or even before that when the impact assessment was done, and it was very new at the time, or quite new. I think it was only Australia which had implemented a couple of months or years before. We didn't really know what the effect would be. So was decided not to impose it at the EU level, and not only just to let member states do whatever they wanted, but to put in the directive a specific provision which would specifically allow member states to do it and incentivize member states to do it with a reporting obligation. And the idea was really to create a feedback. Let's let the member states live their own lives for about 10, 15 years. Let's see what happens. And if it works, we'll adopt it. And that's what's basically happened. We have it now in 8 EU countries, if I'm not mistaken. It could be 9, but overall that. It works. I could come back to what it's really works when it comes to this specific field of law and policy, but in generally, but we see that it does reduce the attractiveness of tobacco products, especially for younger generation, because, well, it's not cool to take out pack with I've put here the less graphic examples, but I think we've all seen more graphic example of what can be put on the tobacco package. It's definitely not cool to have that with you. And the EU Commission has now announced in the Beating Cancer Plan in 2021, as part of the revision of the directive, that it would like to generalize it. So overall, you think, and I have agree with that from this perspective, success story. We have now the evidence we've had, for instance, in France, the evidence is very strong in the UK, numerous studies. And it's if the EU does adopt it, it will be much harder to contest, for instance, by the industry, because we have the evidence base we need. I maybe will not go too much in detail. We have some tension with those flexible modes of harmonization and the fact that all this area of the law is based on Article 114, which is the intermarket legal basis, and tends not to be very sympathetic towards flexibility and minimum harmonization, because, well, to build a single market, if you let member states go beyond the EU standard, well, that doesn't really play well with at least free movement. That's a big question. The other interesting case study is fruit pack nutritional labeling. I've put up some examples on the slide. The one that is most well known is the Nutri-Score on the bottom. It is used here in the Netherlands, so I'm sure a number of you are familiar with it. Basically, same idea at the beginning. Revision of the, or recast of the entire body of law for food information with the FIC regulation 2011 impact assessment. We don't really know how that's going to work. Let's have it at the member state level and let's create that emulation and see what happens. What was decided here is to do a bit different. A hybrid solution was found, because the idea was if we let member states have binding rules imposing on food business operators to have one of those labels, it will highly fragment into our market for food. So what was decided was to have a specific provision that would, again, allow and push member states to recommend the use of voluntary use of those labels, but preventing member states from making it mandatory. That explains why if you go to Albert Heijn today or another day, some products have the Nutri-Score, some products don't have it. And the Netherlands could not decide to make it mandatory everywhere. It's simply prohibited by EU. It works when it comes to Nutri-Score. We could have an hour debate on what that means and whether it is true or not. If you look at the way it was intended to function, and again, on a number of studies, it pretty much does what it's supposed to do. I could talk about it for hours. I'm happy to talk about it for the coffee break, because it is a contested question. And again, the EU has committed to make it harmonized, mandatory, pan-EU in the 2020 Farm to Fork strategy. Success story here, not really, for a number of reasons, which I find particularly interesting. The first one is this hybrid form of harmonization hasn't really worked really well, because what we see is that in terms of consumer protection and health, having some products with the label and some products without goes against the very idea that you need to compare products. So if you have some cereals with the Nutri-Score and some cereals without it, you can't do the basic thing that this label is supposed to do. It does still kind of fragment it at the level of companies, even though it's voluntary, because of course when a member state recommended it, there is a push to have it, etc. What we see, the biggest failure is that we have political deadlock, to the point that this generalization of the Nutri-Score, it's now considered dead. The Commission will not look into it anymore. Why? Because we have had a massive politicization of the question, a huge campaign against the Nutri-Score, led by some member states, not to name Italy. And what's interesting here is that, and that will be maybe the silver lining also for the last case study, is that on the level of the European Commission and the scientists behind the Nutri-Score, we have a discourse about it's the best available evidence, which to a certain extent is true. On the other side, we have cultural politics, we have lifestyle, we have defense of certain products which are indeed bad for health. For instance, when it comes to Italy, Parmigiano Reggiano, Parma ham, etc. But those heritage products perform a role which goes beyond health. And that's just obvious to say. And it doesn't mean that we should not regulate them. It just means that the best available evidence narrative is not, in my opinion, gonna be a good way to argue against narratives which are based on heritage and culture. You need to have another narrative based on something ethical and cultural as well. For instance, explaining that behind those products are actually huge consortium, which are not your local farmers in Italy, but massive multinationals. And the Commission is not really good at doing that. Something that I think is not entirely new. And that goes to my last case studies, which is cigarettes, and that's more work in progress. I'll try to be mindful of time and brief. In tobacco regulation today, we have a big question, which is tobacco regulation has been overall quite effective, very effective at bringing down smoking rates for the youth. Again, because of changing social norms, it is not really cool anymore to smoke. We see drastic decrease in smoking in the youth, and that's what matters, because if you don't start smoking when you're young, the risk that you're going to start later are very low. What we do have is a stock of older smokers, which are very resistant to policy because they're addicted. So it's very difficult to bring those levels down. So we have 30, 40, maybe 50 years of people with high levels of cancer, healthcare costs. What do we do with them? And here comes the question of, would e-cigarettes, cigarettes are risky, they're bad for health, that's established. But if you're a smoker and you switch, it's also very well established that you bring your level of risk really much lower. If you smoke a pack a day, switching to e-cigarette will bring you health benefits. The best being, of course, not to use any of them. So comes the question, can we use e-cigarettes as a harm reduction tool for those smokers which are most resistant to the policy we have at the moment? And here, the evidence is very conflicted because e-cigarette can be a gateway for initiation to nicotine and smoking. It is in the hands of the tobacco industry, which you can be sure are driven by profit rather than anything else. At the same time, it is also one of the most effective ways for smokers to stop, and that there's also evidence of that. And so here the evidence goes in both ways, and you just cannot reach your position just on evidence when confronted to this situation of uncertainty and of conflicting evidence. And what's interesting, and I'll try to cover the slide briefly, is that once again, the position of the European Commission, the case law, has been very much to sort of try to find something that Van Asselt and Vos almost 2 decades ago referred to as the uncertainty paradox. When you don't know, you rely on something certain. And here you see in the case law, it's the WHO opinions, which the court kind of uses as saying, well, precautionary principle, and what we hang on is the WHO because it has the seal of legitimacy. But the WHO, like the European Commission, are very much on the end game side of the debate. They want to eradicate all tobacco products and alternatives, including e-cigarettes, which is a defendable position, but a position you can not only defend on the basis of evidence again, you need to bring back the politics. And we see that with and I'll finish with that, with the current reform of the Tobacco Taxation Directive, which until now only covered tobacco products, so not electronic cigarette. The European Commission is proposing to bring that within the scope of the directive, which is contested by certain public health experts who say you're going to make e-cigarettes more expensive, it's bad for smokers, so the same harm reduction debate. And what's interesting here is that you have, for instance, statements made by Commissioner Oliver Varhelyi for Health, which are almost a denial of evidence, saying e-cigarettes are bad for your health as much as tobacco, which is simply untrue. And so there's a difficulty to finish with that, and I think it goes through the 3 case studies for, I see it in this field, for EU law and the actors, the court, the commission, to sort of bringing back the political in when faced with uncertainty and lack of evidence, and kind of acknowledge the normative underpinnings of what they're doing, which is, yes, we want a world free of tobacco and e-cigarettes. We're going to kill the tobacco industry. That's what we're striving for. And if some smokers don't have a way to quit smoking in the meantime, it's a risk we're ready to take. And that's a political judgment, which, you might agree or not, but at least it's clearly put forward. Same with Nutri-Score. Yes, maybe it's going to penalize some heritage products, but again, we think that we are clear with what we're doing. So yeah, I'll try to. I will finish with that. It's been a bit fast on the last slide, but hopefully, still made sense. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Vincent.